Good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome from sunny Cape Town. We've survived a cold front over the last few days, so I'm very grateful for the warmer weather today. Whew, we've had quite an afternoon. I'm just glad that I could come here now, sit down and get ready for a great session because as Cassandra was saying in the chat, we've definitely been trying to resolve and solve a lot of complex technical issues this afternoon, but I think that we are set and ready to bring you an absolutely provoking session tonight. So get cozy, but not too cozy, because our facilitator tonight has an exciting lineup for you filled with thought-provoking content, fun activities, and loads of techniques for you to go and implement back into your workplace. So I can't actually believe that it's our 6th live session already that we've run this year, with a host of 7 live sessions that we showcased last year in 2021. And we are truly grateful at how our open source series has taken off and how it's been received by you, our community. So tonight, we actually just wanted to take an opportunity to ask you a few questions, to really just share with us what is it that you want to hear as we prepare for our next virtual events next year. We are going to pop a link in the chat. It's only about 4 questions. And just choose them. It's going to take less than 2 minutes. We are so curious to hear what kind of content we can bring to you next year. And for those of you that don't know, our content that we based all our sessions on this year is all come from our published research from our Workforce 2030 curriculum. So perhaps psychological safety interests you, digital skills, or remote work, let us know. All right, so whilst you're doing that, I'm going to test your multitasking skills, and I'm just going to run through some housekeeping rules this evening. If you can please ensure that all of your microphones are switched off, we'd really appreciate that. Our post-event recording, our on-demand recording, we are going to send to you as soon as it comes out of post-production next week, Tuesday. So look out for that. And please just make sure that you are engaging and sharing your thoughts with us in the chat box this evening. This is an open platform and we want to hear from you. All righty, all of the housekeeping out of the way. Finally, we can get the show on the road. So I have the absolute pleasure tonight to introduce to you our lead facilitator, Cindy Londt, a powerhouse and the operations executive right here at Omni. With 18 years experience in the field of education, training and development, she is passionate about client relationship consulting and has a wealth of knowledge and experience in crafting strategic learning and development solutions to meet skills development objectives. Cindy, I cannot wait for the session. Get ready. This is going to be an absolute goodie. The floor is yours, Cindy.
Thanks very much, Jade. Just confirming you can see my slides. Thank you, Darren. Lovely, awesome. Hey, Jade, welcome to all of you that are joining us tonight. I think let's start with some of the key concepts. So Jade has introduced us to the concept of complex problem solving. And tonight we'll look at 6 key concepts. So first of all, we're going to look at defining problems and understanding what problem categories are. We'll look at problem solving styles and competencies. We'll look at mastering complex problem solving. And then 2 approaches, one which is design thinking approach to problem solving, and then system thinking approach to problem solving. So to kick us off, I think when I started preparing for tonight's session, I came across the following quote, and I just thought, oh, that really just resonates in terms of what we so often find ourselves saying. So it talks about impossible only means that you haven't yet found the solution. And I think what that really says to us is that often we look at problems and it seems like there's just no solution. We can't get to how are we going to possibly end up fixing this. But really what it says is that challenges certainly make life interesting, and overcoming them certainly makes life more meaningful. So things like breakthroughs in science and technology, social movements and thriving organizations all require to be driven by a purpose. So really the secret to motivating individuals and teams to achieve great things is this purpose. So Salim Ismail, he's a Canadian technology strategist and lead author of Exponential Organizations. He highlights the role played by purpose in groups and organizations, and specifically individuals really wanting to transform the world through their organizations. And he refers to the purpose as massive transformational purposes. And it really is a new paradigm beginning with a mission statement. So Ishmael suggests that it begins with a problem that an organization is wanting to solve. And by establishing purpose and passion, we enter a new era where individuals really look at making a massive impact on things that we could never have imagined before. But to achieve this, problem-solving skills become critical. Now, fortunately, like any other skills, they can be improved through guidance and practice. And the exciting thing about problem solving is that humans appear to have acquired quite a taste for making the impossible possible. So if you just think of things like mastering flight, instant global communication, and then space travel. But incredible breakthroughs don't just happen. So challenges should motivate and inspire. And problems create opportunities, really forcing us to look at things differently and how things can be looked at. So let's have a look at creative juices and problem-solving skills. So what we're going to start with tonight is every time you see a little dice coming up on the slide, it means that we're going to test your fastest finger first, number one, but number two, some problem-solving techniques and skills throughout the session. So let's start off with our first one. And I'm going to ask you to pop it into the chat for me. So if you're looking at the slide at the moment, you can see that we have 10 pens laying in logical order. And it starts off from the left and it says there's 1, there's 2, there's 3, and there's 4. Now, this problem-solving requirement requires us to move one pen to reverse the order. Okay, so just to confirm, there's 10 pens. They're in an order of 1, 2, 3, 4 on the slide. And what we're wanting to do is we're wanting to reverse it. So we're wanting to have 1 pen, 2 pen, 3 pen, 4 pens. So the question is, by moving 1 pen, how do we reverse the order of those pens? So fastest finger first. I'm interested to see if you can solve for us tonight. Okay, so I'm seeing a couple of answers coming through. If I'm understanding correctly, we're moving the second last pen on the right-hand side, and we are popping it into this gap over here. So what we should now have is 4, 3, 2, and 1. So well done to all those that have got that. Jade is going to monitor the chat for us so that we can have some spot giveaway prizes at the end of the evening. All right, so let's have a look. A problem really is defined as the current gap between the required state and the current state. In other words, where we want to see ourselves in terms of a situation, process, product, or as an organization, or the gap between expectations and the reality. So the Gerald famous Abraham Maslow, It refers to the concept commonly known as the law of instrument or Maslow's law, okay? And his quote says that if the only tool you have is a hammer, you tend to see every problem as a nail. So really what it does is it refers to an over-reliance on the familiar or favorite tool. So it says what happens is we become so used to using the same old tools that we stop looking at things from a different perspective and with a different approach. So it's important to learn different and new ways of thinking and behaving while facing recurring challenges. The bottom line is that if we continue to use familiar and standard problem-solving methods, this often creates unnecessary struggles, frustrations, and delays, and really just leads to ineffectiveness in solving problems. We need to keep reaching, in other words, if we keep reaching for the same hammer as if every business problem was a nail. It's important to analyze different types of problems that we encounter and understand what kind of problem we're dealing with, and then be able to assess what are the different methods, tools, and problem-solving techniques or models that can be applied. This really just helps us to choose the best approach to addressing the problem. So whilst there's a number of problem-solving categories, what I'm doing tonight is I'm looking at Snowden's problem categories. And simply because what we're looking at is understanding and demonstrating the aspect of complex problem solving. So if we just have a look at the diagram that defines the different categories, I think we can see that there's various examples in our business and everyday life. So as I work through them, I want you just to think about it and go and understand how we can categorize different problems. And when I get to complex problem solving, I want you just to pop it in the chat for us around what do you think are some of the complex problems that we're currently sort of experiencing, either in our personal lives, as a world, as a society, but specifically in business. So it talks about simple problems, and really simple problems is known and obvious problems. So we can look at them, they have problems, simple solutions, and it's quite easily solved. There's one solution and it's quite intuitive with regards to what is the solution to the problem. When we're dealing with more complicated problems, it talks about the fact that you need to have an expert. So this kind of problem is where you have some known unknowns. So you're walking into the problem and you know that there's going to be certain areas that individuals are not necessarily going to know the answers to, and it's going to need a little bit of brainstorming and engagement with individuals that are experts in the field. Now, complex problems are typically those that require us to approach them from multiple and sometimes competing perspectives, which may have multiple solutions. So the optimal solution is often newly generated rather than an existing solution. And conflict problems are categorized by the unknown. So what it really says to us is that we know that there are going to be a number of unknown unknowns. So the rules and the relationship between cause and effect are generally just unknown. We're not going to know what we're dealing with until we're in it. So can you think of a few very current and relevant complex problems we're dealing with in business and as a society? You can pop those into the chat. And then the last one on the bottom left talks about chaotic problems. And it says chaotic problems are essentially a crisis. It seems like there's no relationship whatsoever between cause and effect. We are literally just acting, sensing, and responding. And then we wait and we try and let the chips fall and decide where do we end up. And then we re-engage the problem to ascertain and go, okay, what is it that we can now look at? What do we now sit with in terms of problem? And how do we now start looking at it? So I'm just looking at some of the things coming through: climate crisis, economics post-COVID, 100%. We can all talk about the return to work policy, hybrid policy, HR aspects, engaging with our people, 100%. So when we start looking at the different levels of problems and complex problem solving, Holmgren illustrates the differences between simple, complicated, and complex problems by considering the different types of change, the learning and the thinking being applied. So I think if we look at some of the key concepts in the diagram, many of the problems companies are facing are moving from complicated to complex, mainly because of the underlying societal technologies, systems, and the volume of change that organizations are going through. But if we have a look, it talks about simple, and it gives us a really nice example of baking a cake. Now, I'm unsure in my world if that would be simple, but simple talks about the fact that it's very limited change. I think probably if I take a recipe and I follow the recipe, the chances are, as much as it's a simple problem, I will probably learn through it and I'll probably end up with the result. Of course, we then look at complicated, and it gives an example of complicated being making a rocket. And it talks about the fact that it's probably going to be quite difficult to do. We're going to have to spend some time with subject matter experts grappling with what needs to be done. There's going to be risks, but the bottom line is that we're going to find the right way to do it. So there's change that needs to take place and reorganizing thoughts and how we approach it. There's going to be a double loop of learning because we know that we need to get things right. And lastly, there's going to be a lot of critical system thinking, logical approach to how we tackle this complicated problem. And then I think for those of us that are parents in the room tonight, I think the example used here around complex problem solving is a really good one, which talks to the fact like raising a child. And I think when we look at this and we look at some of the words, it talks about unknowable. And I think for those of us, we've either been on the receiving end of this or we have given it. But there's all sorts of advice that we receive when we're parents and when we have children. And everybody wants to give you books to read, and everybody wants to give you lots and all sorts of suggestions of how best to do it. The reality is, though, is that it is quite ambiguous. There's lots of risks. We don't necessarily know what we don't know. That's the important thing. There's going to be a lot of transformational change. Things are going to change on a day-to-day basis in terms of how you manage this, need I say, a complex problem. There's going to be loops of learning where we're constantly questioning, are we doing the right thing? Is the decision we're making today the right thing? And it's a lot of testing and checking and going, if I do this, this is the outcome. Is it working? Yes, no. Do I need to shift and change? And then the last thing it talks about in terms of types of thinking is lateral, creative, disruptive thinking. And it really is around saying, if we look at it, where does the problem sit? Is it simple? Can it be intuitive in terms of I know what I need to do? Is it a little bit more complicated and there's some knowns and some unknowns? But in complex problem solving, it really is about saying, how are we tackling the unknown unknowns? All right, so we have our next dice up. So, ladies and gents, I'm sure somewhere along the line you've seen these before. There's a word, a little box on the screen, and the question it asks you is, what does that mean? So if we had to unscramble that and unpack that as a complex problem solving, what am I trying to tell you? What's the one word that makes? I'm not seeing any come through in the chat. Thank you, Darren. Awesome. Good afternoon. I'm seeing that as the first one come up into the chat. Nazima, thank you. Yes, 100%. So it's good afternoon. Right, lovely. So I know that some of you are still with me. All right, so there's another example for us just around simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic as an example. And so this one talks to, when I looked at it, it's an example in our e-learning, and I thought, sure, it makes sense. It's probably quite simplistic, but it really demonstrates the concept and the thought process around problems. So the first one talks about simple, and it says, how do I roll down the window of my car? So somewhere along the line, we've all had the turner, I'm sure. Our kids don't know anything about those. Or we're pressing a button. We know we've got the window opened. Complicated when it comes to owning a vehicle is, how do I stop my car from blowing smoke? I wouldn't know. That for me would be very complicated. But I'm pretty sure that it involves taking the car apart and the engine apart and finding a way to fix it. The next one talks about complex, and it says, well, how will car drivers react to self-driving cars on the road? It's a complex problem. We know that it's coming, and we know we're getting self-driving cars. I guess the question we ask ourselves is, okay, cool, so what does this mean? Do we really need to put them on the streets? How do we see drivers responding to this? Complex problem in terms of how this is all going to work. And then the last one it talks about is chaotic. And it says, well, the questions we ask ourselves is, what are the unknowns? So what will the societal benefit be of low accident rates from self-driving vehicles? And will this be offset against the higher rates of drinking and driving? And quite simply put, it says we actually can't know. We need to introduce self-driving cars. We need to watch the behavior of consumers over a period of years and decide, well, what was the impact of this decision? So it sounds simplistic, but when you look at it, self-driving cars is a complex problem in terms of how it's going to be implemented, but it can certainly lead to some chaos. So when we look at complex problem solving, I think for all of us, we look at complex problem solving differently. So for some of us, I think we revel in solving problems, and we're going to start seeing it in the chat because we're going to see Foster's fingers first, and we're going to see people jumping on it because they're excited to get into it. For others, not so much. It can be overwhelming. It typically lends itself to the concept of change, and all the moving parts and all the new aspects can bring about anxiety linked to that. So it talks about the fact that there's 3 problem-solving styles. And so the first one is activists. Generally seen as adaptive and innovative, they do, however, seek the shortest route to solve the problem, and instead of taking the time to potentially review the facts. So they're quite diverse in their thinking, and they want to make a decision and move on pretty quickly. Idealists search for the best and ideal solution. So they will typically throw their nets wide. They will look at information, talk to others, weigh pros and cons, look at the theory, take a step back and go, well, what is the holistic view of this problem? And then decide to come back and go, okay, how do we solve it? The last one is realists, and they really are defined as sort of more sensitive, relying mainly on facts, expert opinions, seeking concrete solutions for long-term solutions. So it talks about the fact that they take on a more sensible view to problem solving. So the question then is, if we all have different styles and different approaches, comment, what if the person is a blend of all 3? Probably good. I think it probably lends itself to what is the problem and how sort of in tune do you want to be in solving it, I guess. So if we have different styles and approaches, what then are the skills and competencies required for effective complex problem solving? So we've got different styles and we've got a whole lot of competencies that support that. So complex problem solving requires a range of cognitive and metacognitive skills to be used by the problem solver to identify and resolve a problem. And these competencies are generally required and developed through exposure to and working with problems at different levels, which makes sense. So it talks about analytical skills, which I think really just lends itself to the component of research and exploring and understanding different problems and sort of ineffective and effective solutions to addressing problems. Creativity is either intuitive or systematic in terms of solving problems. It's obviously an important skill that encourages differences and empowers innovative solutions to problems, which we'll see later when we start looking at it. Creativity forms quite an important skill around using the different methods. Critical thinking is deliberate. They look at processes and systems, better able to make decisions and generally understand how things fit together. And then naturally decision making, if you're looking at a problem, looking at various solutions, somewhere along the line, the decision needs to be made with regards to what are the options, what are the alternatives, and making a decision on the approach. And then, like anything else, communication skills are needed. Clear communication, both written and verbal. We need to know how to clearly communicate problems to others and look at information from a logical and as concise perspective for addressing and articulating that problem. And then naturally, emotional intelligence. When we look at it, problem solving doesn't happen in isolation. We're engaging with others. So the question is then, what drives our emotions? How do we manage behaviors? And how does that impact on sort of the debates and the discussions that happen within the problem solving process? So how do we then ensure that we're practically applying these skills when engaging with our people to influence an environment that supports and grows? So complex problem solving with regards to competencies. So we have another dice. Let's have a look. Next one. What's that one, ladies and gentlemen? Okay, I've got one answer in the chat. Anybody else? Cool. So thank you. I think for Foster's finger first, there was Natasha. So thank you. Well done. And then being second by a couple of others. All right. So I can start seeing who our Foster's fingers are and who the ones are motivated to engage. All right. Leaders and managers really create the culture that encourages employees to use their initiative when it comes to problem solving. So it talks about just a couple of techniques that us as leaders ensure that we're creating the space for that. So we're looking at opening lines of communication. The more people understand the business deadlines, operational challenges, the better equipped they will be to be able to make decisions and deal with problems as they arise. Secondly, I think it's around listening to our people and showing interest in suggestions. And I think the more we engage with clients at the moment, I think we're hearing that a lot. We're sitting with the diversity of generations in business, and often it's about listening to other people in terms of the thought processes and how we look at things differently. So yeah, listening to feedback and allowing others to engage. Frequent engagement, getting feedback, looking for views and opinions. And then the last one it gives us around ongoing training and coaching we needed. So as we engage with our people and we deal with problems on a daily basis, it's around ensuring that people understand what worked, what didn't work, but still encouraging them to continue to engage in those feedback loops and those problem-solving initiatives. So when we look at mastering complex problem-solving specifically, the conventional approach to problem-solving usually involves the methodical approach and process with steps and stages. And we know this. And the processes and stages really depend on the context and the type of problem. However, the generic process pretty much remains the same, irrespective of the degree of complexity and the type of problem that's been solved. So irrespective of the problem complexity and the type, 5 basic steps. It talks about identifying and define the problem, analyze the cause, identify possible solutions, select, develop, and implement an action plan, and then monitor and evaluate to determine what's working and what's not working. So if Jade can help me, we're going to pop a quick poll into the chat box, and I'd love to know from you your thoughts around complex problem solving and how much time should be spent identifying and defining the problem. So there we go. You guys should be seeing it on your side. So it says, if you were given an hour, 1 hour, 60 minutes to solve a complex problem, how much time would you spend defining the problem before looking at options to solve it? Your thoughts. How much time should we spend defining the problem before we look at options? So in the chat box, if you can vote for me, we should be able to pull through. Are you guys seeing the poll in the chat box? Okay. It's not giving me your answers at this stage, unfortunately. So I'm not getting the poll. I'd love to have known what you guys said. Thank you. So Nazima, you've hit the nail on the head. So let's go there. So when asked how much, sorry? Somebody was going to say something?
No, I just wanted to know, Cindy, sorry, if you wanted me to read out the percentages for you.
That would be great. Go for it, Jay. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. So we have 15 minutes, 37%, 30 minutes, 37%, 45 minutes, 20%, and then more than 50 minutes, 3%.
Awesomeness. Thank you, Jade. Thank you. Okay, so Nazima just, I'm going to say, took the words right out of my mouth based on the comment that you popped into the chat. So on the screen, you'll see it says Einstein was asked the exact question or made a statement. And he says when he was asked how much time he would spend given an hour to solve a thorny problem, Einstein said that he would spend 55 minutes defining the problem and alternatives and only 5 minutes to solving it. So it's interesting, just from poll, I guess we've also lent ourselves to spending less time, I'm assuming, in defining the problem than spending more time in trying to fix the problem. Where it talks about this is exactly the opposite of what the vast majority of executives do today. So it says, while Einstein was no special talent aside from being passionately curious, he appreciated the value of analysis and he knew how to make time for insight. So it talks about the fact that the gap analysis process really depends on the context and should be tailored to meet organizations' business needs. By spending time analyzing the gaps, you will understand the problem more clearly and be better able to communicate and define a problem. And so defining the problem will be the greatest challenge. People really begin problem solving by focusing directly in the heart of the problem. And more often they begin by looking at the effects of the problem and fundamentally what the problem actually is. Lovely. So, and as Emma's just saying there, we spend more time, and there it is again, we spend more time looking at the symptoms than looking at the problem. And it talks about the fact that if you solve the symptom, you will not have actually solved the problem. And you will inevitably have the same problem occurring over and over again. The key is to work out from a gap analysis to best fit your need and business objective. So step number 2 is around analysis of the problem. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think we've probably all come across it somewhere along the line. But it talks about this stage involves observation, inspection, fact-finding, and sort of getting a clear picture of what are the barriers. So we need to elicit information from various stakeholders, and we need to understand, what is the key and the root of it. So some tips here, it talks about distinguishing fact from opinion. So looking at facts and evidence, it's sometimes we get caught up in the who's the problem or what's the problem, rather than taking a step back and understanding what's the information. We anticipate that there could be multiple causes. It's not necessarily just a single cause. And to stay away from sort of the witch hunt, talks about the witch hunt and who did what wrong that led to the problem. So there's 2 graphics here that organize this information. The one is the fishbone, and it really just helps teams to brainstorm possible causes and problems, to look at the root cause of an issue and effect. Okay, so it talks about establishing the problem effect, looks at identifying what is the problem, and then it says identify the major causes of that problem along the fishbone, and then unpacking these still further. So we start getting a visual representation of the challenges and the problems. The second one is the why diagram, and I so love this one. It talks about the fact that we so often forget to ask ourselves the question why. Yes, but why? Yes, but why? And it's something that our kids do so well. And yet we keep saying, because I said so, often we do. But the method that we're using here of the why is really about going, how do we get one step further into the nitty-gritty of what is the actual problem? So it talks about the fact that somebody will start with a question of why, and then at each level unpack it further and further to really just get to a spread of ideas. Okay, so it encourages us to go back to our childhood and just get that creative thought process thinking. So, once we've got the two sort of pictures of the why, we then need to look at the possible solutions. And again, these ones here, I think we've all touched on them somewhere, but it is around then saying, how do we generate a range of possible solutions and actions? And so it gives us 5 typical techniques for generating these ideas. So the first one is brainstorming, and I think we're comfortable with that. It really is about putting people in a room and going, how do we just unpack this? How do we debate it? What do we look at in terms of ideas and solutions? And I guess the trick here is really just to say nothing is impossible, again, going back to the beginning, but also it's around saying generate ideas. Nothing is off the table. So we abstain from, I'm saying that's not possible. No, that's not going to work. Just generating ideas. The second one is mind mapping, which lends itself really nicely to the creatives because it talks about the fact that you can start from a central point, but as you unpack that, so it evolves into the different categories, which can then be sort of grouped together. Of course, the map also lends itself to doodling, pictures, symbols, and obviously colors and branches. So it creates a visual mapping of the problem and how do we start mapping it. I suppose it inspires and creates a logical process, but also allows for the more creative way of looking at it. Then there's questionnaires. So, I mean, we've all done this somewhere along the line if we want to do research and we want to get information. But it talks about starting with some of the sort of simplistic questions. So what is the problem? Actually, let's just clarify, is it really a problem and what is the impact? But then it says, well, how do we then unpack it to the next level? And how do we make sure that we really get into the nitty-gritty of understanding what is the problem that we are truly trying to fix? So it's about scratching and making sure that we're getting to the root. What ideas do we have to solve it? And what are some of the action steps that we can now possibly start taking? So we can get all of this information, collate the information to be able to make use of the data. The last two, Delphi technique and nominal group, are very similar. It comes out of the questionnaires. The only difference really is that the Delphi technique looks at talking to subject matter experts, asking a round of questions, getting all sorts of information together and going, well, what is the outcome and what is the sort of the group consensus on the solution? And the nominal effect looks at a variety of solutions and problems, and then they get rated on a rating 1, 2, 3, 4. And again, that then comes out to say, well, based on the feedback, this is then obviously kind of the best solution to the problem. Okay. So that's just some of the techniques that we can use. Step number 4, select, develop, and implement the action plan. So we really are now there where we're saying, well, we understand that we've unpacked the root cause. We've looked at possible solutions. The question we now ask ourselves is, what is the approach? So which approach will best solve the problem? And here we're looking at for the long term. So it's not for the now. It's about saying, what is the most realistic? So if we consider advantages, disadvantages, what is the end goal? How is this going to look? And then what is the risk associated with each of those action points? And last but not least, how will we know that the problem is actually being solved? So action planning, checkpoints, timeframes, support systems, resources. What are the things that we need to put in place to ensure that this action plan actually is executed in a manner that gets us to our end goal? Of course, all that being said and done, bottom line is monitor and evaluate the process. So continuous performance improvement and review. So we all know, I'm sure, and comfortable with PDA, and this really looks at how do we make sure that we're monitoring and evaluating the progress. And it talks about the fact that we need to, again, be open to feedback. So ask others for input. Separating, though, again, opinion and feeling from facts and reality. So how do we make sure that when we're monitoring and evaluating that what we're getting is the facts to be able to work with and use? So avoid impulsiveness in terms of solutions and monitoring. Don't abandon your solution immediately at the first sign of problem, as in this is not working. Again, you're going through the change cycle. So it could just be there's teething problems. We need to try and test, review, get feedback. Keep your solution monitoring simple, and wherever possible, consider how many times you're going to do the process of reviewing. And then it talks about the fact, compare the cost that you've incurred against the benefits that were obtained. So I think that's quite important to say, well, got to spend money to be able to go through this process, but ultimately, what is it going to save us in the end? It's not necessarily just about money, but optimization, efficiencies. But the bottom line is we've got to go through the process, and sometimes it takes a little bit longer. Sometimes we don't always get it right, but it's about the constant checking. So keeping track of how the solution is working is important for ongoing, and then some degree of flexibility when it comes to, is things working, or do we need to make some small shifts for continuous improvement? Okay, so you'll see there it talks about planning, so defining it. What is the solution? What is the situation? Identify any causes. Go and define what it is that we're looking at. Double check buy-in from stakeholders and manage any resistance to the change. Implement it, monitor it, check the data, monitor the outcomes, and then decide if it's an appropriate plan, and are we implementing and are we improving? Okay, let's see. Next one. I must be honest, ladies and gents, I really struggled with this one. I looked at this one long and hard, and then I had to go look at the answer because I couldn't get to it. Anybody? Two-month recovery at home, 2 months before I see you at home. Interesting. I really struggled with this one. Okay, I'm going to leave it till the end because the answers are in the end. So if you think about it, pop it in the chat. Hurry up, April. I like it. I don't know, there's a couple of variations running through, but nobody quite hitting the nail on the head. All right, let's have a look here. So if a problem is complex, it means that it has many components, and we've spoken about it. We talk about the fact that, thank you, Tamron. Well done. May I see you home? Well done, Tamron. Okay, so complexity doesn't necessarily mean difficulty, but we understand that complex problem solving has multiple moving parts and multiple unknowns. So complex problem solving is concerned with people's ability to handle tasks that are complex and dynamic. So typically moving, shifting all the time, ill-defined and unrealistic. So what design thinking does is it's a process of designing something which will include testing and seeking feedback. And I think it goes to the slide that I was just talking to before. However, I think what happens here is a lot of our creatives, when we're creating products, looking at services, looking at processes and procedures, it's around saying, how do we make improvements and adjustments through retesting until we're satisfied that it's working? So complex, wicked problems are shrouded in the unknowns, and the root cause is often complicated, and the problem is often unclear. So these problems can benefit from some design thinking. So four key concepts, or four key steps within the process, but it really is around observing and defining. So rather than accept the problem as it is, people explore the problem and its context further. So unpack it, define it, debate it, really work with it. And then ideate and prototype. So designers come up with ideas and prototypes, then they implement this, they try out the model, they test it, get feedback, input, review, incorporate some of those ideas in the next iteration, and then the process starts all over again. And I think we see that a lot in business. Often, I know I specifically say to our team that often when we start something and we do new processes, we want to be able to go through the process of implement, check, test. Is it working, shift and change? But sometimes what's happening is that we're moving so fast that you can be into the third or fourth time before you're able to start actually implementing the changes within that process. So the quicker we review, the quicker we talk, the quicker we look at feedback and input, the quicker we're able to make those shifts. Okay, so it talks about design thinking can also be thought of a system of overlapping spaces rather than a sequence of orders. And I think that goes to what I was just saying. It's not necessary that you're going to get to step 1, 2, 3, 4, and then go back to step 1. You could do step 1, 2, start step 3. Hold on a second, this is not necessarily going to work. Let's just go back. Feedback, input, look at ideas, and move forward again. So projects can loop back through inspiration, ideation, and implementation, sometimes more than once and sort of on an ongoing basis. What it talks about, though, just in terms of key concepts, it says design thinking is a solution-based approach rather than a problem-based approach, which is interesting. So it looks at it the opposite way around. We have an outcome defined as an objective rather than a clear problem. And we use that objective to generate and validate solutions and options. Very much divergent right brain thinking, followed by left brain thinking. And each option is tried to a prototype. And we continuously deliver on something until we're happy that it's met our criteria and that it's ticking the box in terms of what we wanted to achieve. Okay, so design thinking helps us to understand the situation, generate ideas, more soft solutions rather than hard logic in the approach. And then the last one, it looks at system thinking approach to complex problem solving. And it was interesting for me when I looked at this one. I think somewhere again in our careers, we've seen this mountain and what's under the water versus the tip of the iceberg. And it's used in multiple different examples for different things. But it talks about the fact that system thinking is an approach to problem solving that attempts to balance holistical thinking and reductionist thinking. So in practice, really what it means is to take a step back, to zoom out, and to ask ourselves the questions with regards to how are the things that we're potentially not seeing, how is it impacting on the top in terms of what we are seeing? So involves seeking team members, looking at different aspects, working with different departments, different problem-solving techniques, kind of breaking out of the silos and going, how do we look at had fresh perspectives to this? Okay, so it talks about the fact that we spend most of our time looking at the top, thinking about and responding to the effects, the impacts and the failures, rather than going and saying, what are the aspects underneath that we need to be considering to really unpack the solution? So we're alerted to the problem on the surface, but 90% of that root cause is sitting at the bottom. And I think it goes back to what we've spoken around, making sure we get to the root, making sure that we're spending sufficient time understanding what the problem is. Otherwise, we find ourselves fixing the symptom and not actually the problem itself. Okay. The bottom line is problems cannot be solved by the same mindset that created them. And I think we hear that often. Sometimes we can be so stuck in the process and part of the process that we're not really able to take a step back and go and say, well, how do we look at this differently? Go back to Maslow. If we keep doing the same thing, keep looking at it with the same approach, keep approaching it with the same tools and techniques, the reality is that we're not going to look at it differently and we're not going to find the solution. Nothing is impossible. Everything is possible. Okay. So I'm going to wrap up with the solution and just the last little brain teaser for the night. And then I think there's some chats and some questions sitting in the chat, which I'll answer. But yeah, in reality, really, I think it talks about the fact that in the next 30 years, it's going to be quite pivotal for our society. And I think as a human race, we face massive changes in things like feeding the world, creating employment, sustainable health, safety of our people and the planet. And yeah, just in terms of how things are changing and shifting and moving. And technology holds lots of possibilities. And there's lots of things happening in science that tell us what we can do. The reality, though, is it doesn't tell us how we should be doing it. And so I think that lends itself a lot to the ethics and authenticity of leaders and how we approach complex problem solving and how we tackle the real problems that we're sitting with. The great thing about problem solving is that there really is as many solutions and schools of thought as what there is problems to solve. So apart from the above, lots of approaches, lots of processes, the most important part is just trying to do something, make a decision, try something out, build our own personalized processes that best suit our unique context. And then just the quote there, it says, the measure of success is not whether you have a tough problem to deal with, but whether it's the same problem you had last year. And I think that's the reality. We're going to constantly have change, and change comes problems, complex problem solving, different ways of doing things, different ways of looking at things. But if we keep doing it the old way, we're not going to move forward. And the measure of success really is, have we changed and adjusted from the problem we had last year, last month, yesterday, to how we're doing it today? And there's our last brain teaser. Play on words. So for all of you that are maybe analytics in the room, I know for me it's very frustrating not to have the answer. So there they all are. It's good afternoon, backing up. May I see you home? This one still catches me every time. Even though I know the answer, I still have to think about it every time. And then the last one is play on words. So well done for those of you that popped it into the chat. I know Jade was monitoring, and I'm sure we will ensure that you get your prize sent in your direction. But I do think that there were some questions. I saw Kaz pop up with a message.
Cindy, we had a question from Manisha Reina. She wanted to know, how does mindset and analyzing a problem statement based on one's experience and perspective while solving and defining a problem, how do you get to a consensus? I'm just going to pop that in the chat so it pops up again.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the reality is, it goes back, I suppose, to the opening statement when I said anything is possible, number one. And really, how do we tackle and look at problems? We either look at it from a perspective of anything is possible and we sort of revel in dealing with problems and challenges, or we tend to feel quite overwhelmed by challenges and problems, and then we tend to shy away. So I guess mindset for me is around, how do I look at it and how do I approach it? Again, underpinned by change. We are in a cycle at the moment of so much change that it can also become overwhelming and create a level of anxiety and unwillingness or inability almost, just based on everything happening around us, to be able to change, to be able to look at a problem differently. So yeah. I don't know if that answers the question, but for me, mindset is just how I think about it and how I approach it. And we're either going to be in a space where we can look at something being possible and looking at the sort of the world being our oyster, or going and saying, this is actually just too much. I don't know where to go to next. And that's going to have a direct impact on the ability to generate the problem statement and the solutions versus just not being able to move. And I guess getting consensus, I don't know. I suppose it goes back to the leader in terms of generating ideas, getting feedback, getting input, looking at solutions. Jean-Marie's not just put a comment in there around collaborative skills, 100%. So engaging, getting feedback, getting input, making sure, I suppose, stakeholders are involved in the decision-making process to almost create the buy-in. Because once you've got the buy-in, that's an easier way to be able to get consensus. Sure, Kazi. Spending so much time on Gapple. Yeah, Kaz, a true comment. So Kaz is saying, spending so much time on gap analysis and defining a problem, how does this impact the leader's ability to be agile and deal with business continuity? Kaz, I think 100%. I think this is how I would answer the question. The gap analysis is important and you're spending about 95% of the time doing that. But I do think it needs to happen quite quickly. So as leaders at the moment, I think we need to be quite agile in terms of being able to run through those thought processes in our heads pretty quickly, engage with others quickly, and be able to make decisions pretty quickly. I don't know if I think there's the importance of spending time to unpack the problem is critical. Otherwise, it really is we just sit in the loop and you just feel like you're never, ever, ever moving forward. But in the same breath, as much as you're running through those processes pretty quickly, it is about making sure that you're looking at pros, cons. Is this going to work? Isn't it going to work? Test it, run it, implement it, review it, come back again and keep going. I think in our space, often, in our team, we speak about the fact that we implement things and we run with things pretty quickly because we know we constantly have to do change and we need to look at things differently. As problems exist and as things change and shift, we need to move. The reality, though, I think what's quite important is to always just in that process to come back and just go, is this working? Yes or no? If it is, keep going. If it's not, then what are we fixing to move forward again? So I think the ability to be agile, but the ability to have a huge amount of focus on review, monitor, check, and then move forward again. I think that for me is important. Yeah, so Natasha, just your comment is how do we overcome EQ, things like stress and self-control? 100%. I think it goes to a lot of what I've said around the change, the anxiety, the volumes, the stress of, I guess, and somebody mentioned on the radio this morning the word COVID, and everybody went, what's COVID? It's done. We don't talk about that anymore. But I think we're still living some of the legacy of just the impact of that. The reality, though, is that we're going to have to find a way to shift gears and move. The stress, though, is a challenge when it comes to it. Time, 100% limited. We're all pushing harder. Planning is important, but what if it's not possible? Natasha, I don't know if that's an option. You're talking to an analytical. So the analytical for me is always about planning. It doesn't mean that we can't plan and move at the same time. And that's, I suppose, a terrible statement. But yeah, it goes to exactly for me, if I answer Kaz's question. We need to be agile. We need to move. It doesn't mean that we don't apply the steps. I think it's just about applying the steps potentially quicker and faster and making sure the feedback loops and the review loops are happening. Darren. Yeah, 100%. Darren, spot on. Continuously looking at the analysis at the gap. Yeah, 100% spot on. Agreed. Analysis paralysis, 100%, Cass. Thank you, Nazima. Yes. Continuously developing psychological hardness, 100%. Commitment, challenge, control, and recognizing continuous improvement is better than delayed perfection, 100%. We work with a team. It becomes a bit of a catchphrase in this organization, MVP. Sometimes you've got to just go, enough is enough. Now we need to move. It doesn't mean that it's perfect, but we need to move. And then we can make sure that we put the feedback loops in. 100% agree with that. Love it. Thank you, Jean-Marie. Sometimes it requires us to apply a plaster so that we can plan to solve effectively. True. Very true. I don't know if there's anything else. I don't know, Kazi, if I missed anything. Or Jade, if I missed anything.
It seems like we've covered everything. Thank you, Cindy.
Lovely. Ladies and gents, from my side, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Jade has noted that she'll share the slides and the recording, which is fabulous. So you can receive that in your inbox in next week. Thank you for joining us. Note that obviously this is literally just a snapshot of information. We've taken our module of learning aligned to complex problem solving, and we've stripped out an hour's worth of content. So if there's anything that really stands out for you that's important, or you want to know more, either navigate to our website where you'll be able to pick up our e-learning platform, alternatively make contact with any of us with regards to getting access to additional content and additional information. And then last but not least, just look out for our next open source training session coming up in September. Oh, golly, I think it just went out today. I looked at it. Judgment and decision making. And yeah, my colleague will be taking you through that. It's going to be an interesting one. So yeah, so please look out for the date for next month. I don't know the date off the top of my head. So Kaz is gonna smack me a little later. But yeah, coming up in September, please join us. We love having you guys engaging with us in these sessions. So thank you.